So Smith was interested in human flourishing, and I think that has a kind of Aristotelian influence. I think that feeds through the likes of Marx, Amartya Sen, and so forth. And it frames thinking about the nature of health, capabilities, how we view deprivation as capabilities, shortfalls, and so forth. So there is a tangible link, I would argue, between Smith and the approaches that some people adopt today, and that's shaped my own thinking.
I think one of the things that we discovered when we started to look into the material is that he was really interested in assembling what we would call data. His library is full of books of statistics, it's full of encyclopedias, it's full of collections of travel writing, it's full of proceedings of scholarly societies. So he's reading literature, he is doing that, he's reading philosophy, as we knew, in political economy, but he's also gathering kind of raw information that he's working on, and that I found was quite an interesting insight into the way he obviously worked as a thinker and as a writer. Was this idea that there was this really quite serious empirical dimension to what he was doing, that he was basing his ideas on the evidence that he saw around about him. He's getting it from these literary sources. And he seems, we know from his correspondence, to have sought that stuff out. So we have lots of letters, well, not lots of letters, he didn't leave that many, but we have letters where he writes to people and says, can you send me this book, or can you give me information on this topic, or can you give me the figures on a particular matter?
Yes, we're interested in what makes a nation wealthy. And Smith, of course, understands that wealth is not just about economic wealth, it's about other forms of wealth that we would broadly understand as, sociological in their nature. But also, even when he's talking about that nature of the economy, he's talking about relations. He's talking about exchange. He's talking about barter. He's talking about tolerance. He's talking about the parameters through which these relations can be held or balanced. So for me, as a non-economist, Wealth of Nations still is a treasure trove of ways of thinking about how we think about human interactions that are the building blocks for thinking about the economy and also the wealth of a nation.
So debates about empathy are still absolutely central to political discussion today. I mean, Elon Musk just recently came out against empathy and said it was the main source of human weakness. He called it suicidal. In contrast to that view is the view that what makes us human is the fact that, contrary to the caricature of the Smith of the Wealth of Nations, that we're selfish beings, is that we fundamentally do have an interest in one another's well-being. And the idea that we can begin by, we all begin by caring about certain people who are closest to us, who are most similar to us, but that we can overcome those biases in our empathy, and to learn to care about distant others and learn to care about people who are very different from ourselves. That's still the best available solution to the problem that political scientists today call affective polarization. The idea that more and more in our politics and in our society as a whole, people are having negative feelings towards those who are different from them, with whom they politically disagree. And those emotional bonds that Smith thought were essential to a functioning society and an ethical life are under threat, as empathy is under threat. They recognize the problem that we're dealing with today of this sort of polarization, and they used an 18th century term for it. They called it faction. And faction, it's appropriate that we're celebrating the anniversary of both the Wealth of Nations and the independence of the United States, because the problem of faction was absolutely central to the concerns of the American founders. as well. And there are steps we can take trying to look at things from an impartial point of view, to try to not let those feelings of factional hatred overcome feelings of empathy for ourselves. But ultimately, Hume and Smith and the American founders were all pretty pessimistic on the idea that sort of individual moral improvement, self-cultivation, these sort of mindfulness exercises that people do today, is the kind of thing that can overcome the political and emotional and ethical harm of faction and division. They instead thought that the only hope really is to design a political system where people are not seeing themselves in, especially this kind of Armageddon battle between the forces of good all arrayed on one side and the forces of evil all arrayed on the other. So like James Madison followed David Hume and Adam Smith in thinking that when you have sort of two big factions fighting each other, a two-party system, a two-faction system, then you're going to get heightened antipathy. Whereas if you have lots of little factions, that may be the best you can hope for, none of which is that powerful, none of which demands people's exclusive allegiance. We today might call them intersecting with one another. And in that way, if we're all part of lots of little multiple overlapping factions, we won't have this us versus them mentality quite as much.
The more you learn how to contextualize and get Smith right in what he was doing and what bits of the book are doing in combination with other bits of the book, then the better an understanding you get of the sorts of lessons we can draw for it today and from it today. And I think that's important because it helps perhaps remove a kind of caricature of Smith that's existed in the public mind for some time. If you can show that he is, as he definitely is, a more complex thinker who's very careful in the arguments that he makes, then that in itself helps you better understand what you can take from him and what you can learn from him.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I also think because he's deployed, as you said, to as a founding theorist of economics to support whatever economics is at any given moment in time, that reviving some of the more radical critiques that he's making, not only of corporations, but of other centers of power in society at the time, the universities, the church, all of these kind of centers of authority, that also means that his arguments for, breaking down those concentrations of power can then also be brought into the president, brought to bear, right? That it's if he's being claimed as a supporter of a fully unregulated free market, it's relevant in a contemporary context to say, well, if we care about what Smith actually thought about this topic, that's not what he said.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that comes from being a kind of world historical figure, not to kind of overget, but he is. The thing about that is that in itself becomes a persona associated with a very kind of vague set of ideas that are held to be typical of the whole of that person's work. And there's no disputing the fact that Smith did argue in favor of freer markets, but that's not all that he said. He said a lot of other things that had to be in place in order for that central argument of his to work, that there were lots of political and legal institutions that had to be in place.
Well, that's related to the conception of freedom, right? I mean, I think there's even a deeply, deeply grounded in the 18th century way of doing this, which is to say that when they talk about free commerce and free exchange in the 18th century, they mean commerce between free peoples, right? And that concept of freedom is both economic and political, in a way that I think has been stripped out, right, of the way that we talk about it, right? And so this is sort of where some of the critique of slavery comes from, but it's also where some of the critique of entrenched aristocratic, monarchical sort of church power comes in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as well, there's been a tendency also to think that Smith licenses some of the later moves in economics, particularly, well, this idea that ran through economic analysis for a long time, that the poor had to be kept poor in order to keep them working hard, and that's very obviously completely opposite to what Smith says about that particular set of issues.
Right.
And if it is, then you need to say, well, Smith may be the founding father of economics, but not everything that comes after him in economics can be tracked back to the wealth of
No.
nations.